This is your last chance. After this...
Or should we not follow the advice of the galactically stupid?
That is a nice boulder.
Loaded for speed! Go!
Ladies and gentlemen, coming to you pre-recorded from two undersized apartments in New York City, it's Revenge of the Film Nerds.
There, we're in a tight spot.
I hate when people talk during the movie.
With your hosts, Black Crystal.
I'm not bad. I'm just drawn that way.
And Jack Manley.
What we've got here is failure to communicate.
A podcast for nerds by nerds.
Oh, you betcha, yeah.
Failure is not an option.
And now, here are your hosts, Black Crystal and Jack Manley.
Hello, and welcome everyone to another amazing episode of Revenge of the Film Nerds. It's your girl BK here, and join with me is my amazing co-host, Jack Manley. How you doing, Jack?
I'm doing well today, BK. I gotta say, the longer we get into the month of horror, the more I'm just enjoying these films we're getting into. I'm enjoying sharing them with our community that's growing up around the podcast. It's a good time right now to be doing this, don't you think?
Oh, I can agree wholeheartedly. I mean, I may be a little biased because this is like my favorite season, but I think just sharing these films with the community has been such an awesome, fun thing to do.
And it's been fun for me to get out of my comfort zone. Although I will say, we're talking about a type of horror this week that I actually do not mind and actually have a very sort of fond affection for. So we are getting into the world of zombie horror, BK, but what are we doing that with?
Yes, we are going to be diving into the world of zombies with the amazing 2016 film Train to Busan. Yes, that is right.
Directed by Yeon Sung-ho and written by Park Joo-suk and Yeon Sung-ho. And I gotta say, up top, because I do not speak Korean, I am going to apologize for any pronunciations I get wrong today. We're going all over the world to discuss zombies, so I'm gonna get a lot of pronunciations really, really badly butchered here. So apologies there, but nevertheless, we shall persist in bringing you one of the best modern horror films of all time from the Republic of Korea.
No, seriously though, Jack, I really think Train to Busan is, I argue, one of the best zombie films of all time. And a lot of its inspirations kind of set it up for success. But Train to Busan does something that I think not a zombie film does. And that is being confined to a very single place. And that is a high-speed bullet train that we definitely don't have in America to Busan amongst a zombie apocalypse. Now, there's a lot more that goes into it, Jack, but you think that's a fair summary? How would you put it?
I think so. It's using the, sort of this device of a train to just trap all this diaspora of Korean social hierarchy together. It tells this very, very terrifying, very visceral parable about Korea using zombies. And I think it's a really elegant story, and it's probably one of the, kind of even being one of the most recent adaptations of zombie in film, it's one of the most poignant and I think one of the best entries in a genre that has an extremely long and storied history.
And I think that's really why we chose it, Jack. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but Train to Busan isn't merely another zombie film. It is a culmination of so much of, I hate to say this, zombie culture. I don't like that, but it's zombie lore and horror elements to really present a film that is not only still quite frightening and has a lot of suspense, but it also tells a very great personal story and has a lot of social commentary. And that is definitely not how zombie stories began.
No, absolutely not. Like, zombies did not even approach the form that we know them as today, to be quite honest. Like, they have roots like very far back. It's funny that you use, zombie culture, because they really do actually start out as, culture and start out as folklore. And it's kind of hard to trace the origins of them. They most likely started out in Western Africa in two different forms, in two different cultures. Firstly, in the Congo culture, spelled Kongo, they had Nkisi spirits, Nkisi. And these spirits were basically astral zombies. They were disembodied spirits that could occupy different objects or be, bottled and kept by an owner. And meanwhile, while this tradition existed, you also had the Sangha culture and their tradition of the Zitachane, which was a corporeal undead that moved around. And so these two cultural sort of affectations, basically they existed, but we just don't have a lot of traditional African history due to colonialism and imperialism.
Oh.
Well needed interruption there. We always boo colonialism on this podcast. Eventually, those African traditions coalesced on the island of Haiti, particularly in voodoo culture.
Oh, yes, which is kind of crazy, like, to talk about it. I know we have a lot of voodoo culture. We have things about, like, dolls and pins in them and this sort of mysticism, but there's actually a lot more to it. And when you kind of dive into voodoo, it is more of like a spiritual kind of religion here. And a lot of the Haitian slaves during the time practiced this and believed in these things, and zombies, or a form of zombieism. We're going to say a lot of zom words today, so just buckle up. But was found within voodoo, and the idea of, you mentioned it earlier, Jack, the idea of the soul being detached from the body and kind of not moving on, which we would normally describe as a ghost. But I think here, with the Haitian interpretation of it, really kind of dives into how they believe they would move on into the afterlife. And a zombie really is someone who is unable to do that because they took their own lives. And there is a lot of slavery rooted in that idea, in that notion.
Well, that's exactly right, BK. And one of the things in Haitian society that really reinforced slaves being basically kept in line using voodoo culture and using zombification as a threat was the fact that a lot of slave drivers were actually practicing voodoo priests, and many among them would tout that they were bokor, which was the word in Vodun religion for a necromancer, a sorcerer, or a witch who raises the undead. And so you both have this idea that they could trap your spirit and keep it from passing on, but they would also use suicide in a social construct, because in a lot of cases, zombification would happen because Baron Samedi, when he came to collect your soul, he would somehow be offended by your soul and would reject you, and you as a soul would have to wander until you were accepted, and that would allow your soul to be turned into a zombie. So not only was it this idea that, if you committed suicide, you would wander the earth forever, it's the idea that you would be offending the very religion and denying yourself Valhalla, essentially. Mm-hmm. So it was used, both interpretations of the zombie were used at the time to reinforce a social dynamic. It wasn't really about creatures or horror or, this thing is going to come and get you in the night. It was a threat that you were going to be denied eternity.
It's beautifully put the way you say that, because it's unnerving. And the more you kind of think about zombies as even more of like a projection of the African slaves, they live their lives in day to day as a zombie. I think the worst punishment or hell would be, in fact, that you don't get laid to rest, that you are now put into another form of servitude. That is like the biggest fear. And a lot of times suicide was like a slave's only way to kind of take control over their own body. But the fear of becoming a zombie would kind of stop them from doing that. And that was definitely used against them a lot of the time, like you said, Jack. So I don't know. Finding out all of this is very fascinating to me. And to see, like, the commentary of zombification. Ugh, I hate all these words. They sound like I'm making them up, but I swear they're real. But the idea of zombification being a larger conversation on maybe a social commentary has been rooted back to its origin. So that's awesome for me to see.
And really, BK, it's social constructs that actually bring the zombie, at least the Haitian influences on the modern zombie, into modern Western culture, because in 1915 the U.S. occupation of Haiti began, and during this period there was a resurgence in the Vodun religion, primarily because of the fact that one of the things going on during that occupation was that Catholic missionaries were trying to systematically destroy the voodoo religion. And Haiti, which is well known for the rebellions of its citizens and the rebellious nature of its populace, they, as a counter-reaction to this Christian influence, would incorporate Christian symbols into voodoo and give the religion sort of kind of an early modern revival. And this would attract the attention of occultists like one William Seabrook, who would write in 1929 the book The Magic Island, which is where the concept of the zombie first appears in the West.
I'm just saying, anything named Magic Island got me feeling a little sus, okay? Like, I don't know how I feel about that.
Oh, I mean, no question about it. Seabrook, he gained notoriety through writing these mystical travel logs of places like Africa and Arabia. The typical kind of turning different regions of the world into kind of, racial utopias. That kind of like, Johnny Quest style racism is the way I like to put it.
The way you put that is phenomenal.
But you know what I mean. That's sort of that idea of viewing cultures through this like sort of mystical, ethereal looking glass and elevating them through their mysticism, rather than treating those cultures and those traditions with a certain amount of respect. Mm-hmm. So yeah, the occult focus is what brought it over here, and that exploitative focus is what brought it into the West. And at this point, this is when you start this long sort of 50-year process almost of that culture and that tradition in Haiti joining with a tradition from Europe, BK, because we also have our traditions of undead from that area of the world.
Really? Because, like, I don't know, because my zombie knowledge kind of, like, is in sections. I kind of get its origins. I know a little bit about, like, the idea of the undead. And then my mind goes, like, okay, so straight to 28 Days Later Resident Evil. There's clearly a big gap in between that I'm missing.
Yeah, that's say not quite. We've got to take some leaps to get there. But really, in the West and in Europe, the concept in European folklore starts with the idea of the avenging undead. Particularly examples like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Ambrose Bierce's The Death of Halpin Frasier, and several of Edgar Allan Poe's works popularized this idea of the dead coming back from the grave and rising to avenge some ill that was done to them in real life. And we see this in stories of vampires and vampiric lore. And for a long time, European culture was grounded in that idea, although, again, with Frankenstein, they introduced this idea of science being used to reanimate the dead. And all of this sort of coalesces around, we got to discuss another racist here, H.P. Lovecraft.
Oh!
Who knew zombies had so many problematic sources to becoming something that is so beloved as a, movie monster to this day? But yeah, it has to go through Lovecraft here, because his work, Herbert West Reanimator from 1925, is really where we get the concept of the quote-unquote uncontrollable or savage undead. You see, later in films like White Zombie, and largely up to and through the 50s, zombies were tied to the Bokor, thrall concept, the idea that there was a magician pulling the strings of the undead. And Herbert West Reanimator introduces the idea that while, science and people may have some part in bringing back the dead, we can't potentially control them. And that idea gets further explored in the EC Comics series and Tales from the Crypt series in the 1950s, which would be inspirations to one George A. Romero.
Wow. See, there's the part that I missed it. You want to know what it was, Jack?
What was it?
The books. there are books. That's one, so cool. Like I'm about to dive in. Like, just none of this. Like, you're putting it together in my mind. I'm like, oh, I bet that's a book, and that's probably a book too. Like, we had to have come from something before we got into film, because zombies is just such a widely known cultural phenomenon. It had to be grounded somewhere, and I missed the flippin' books.
Well, it's funny you mentioned those books, too, because one more novel that was adapted into a film would become a huge influence on George A. Romero, who already loved stuff like White Zombie, which was, again, tied very much to the Haitian voodoo folklore. And the book that influenced him was Richard Matheson's 1954 novel, I Am Legend, which would later become the film The Last Man on Earth in 1964. And this would have the concept of undead resurrected as vampiric creatures, seeking out for blood and seeking out victims. The idea of sort of zombies seeking out fodder and food. And so this European idea coalescing into this vampiric lore at the time, and the Haitian ideas that had already been introduced into the popular culture, this became the crucible through which George A. Romero would basically singularly create the zombie with his 1968 film Night of the Living Dead.
What a guy. I'm just saying, I want that on my resume. Single-handedly created the modern day zombie. Like that is sick. So what you're telling me though, Jack, is there's a combination now at this point. We're kind of merging zombie ideas into what I think of as coming out of the soil and hunting human flesh. Question mark?
100%. That is Romero. Like, to the point where the zombies are actually referred to colloquially as Romero zombies. It is just an exclusive archetype that he created by blending those Haitian and European influences together to essentially create a creature we had never really seen on screen before. We had this conception of zombies as, thralls. We had this conception of the vengeful undead, but we didn't have this unthinking, unfeeling mass of corpses and flesh coming to find and feast upon the living until Romero really blends together those cultures. So we have vampires to thank for zombies, we have Haitian folklore and voodoo culture to thank for zombies, and this amalgamation was so potent that it was a visceral thing. It was truly terrifying. It was something that went from, as people described it in their movie-going experience, from being sort of like delightfully scary to genuinely horrific. It was a film that etched itself into the collective consciousness of people in the late 60s.
That's wild to me. I'm still processing this. Like that there is a whole time period of zombie information that I've missed out on. Like I can't believe it. Like this Romero is like my guy now.
No, Romero is not only responsible for turning the modern zombie into what it is. 10 years later, when he would do his follow-up, Dawn of the Dead, he would create the 20th century's most successful zombie film. And more than that, BK, this is the crucial point in our story where zombies become forever linked to the metaphor of consumerism. Because he sets the original Dawn of the Day in the mall and uses the entire film to draw these very, very striking metaphors about people being drawn to consumerist culture, it just indelibly made that something that zombies will always be a reference to.
That's fascinating because even in like a lot of modern day like games that are like zombie subgenres, like things like, I don't know, Sunset Overdrive, to throw a random video game out there, where it's like consumerism, you drank too many energy drinks, you became a zombie, question mark. Like it is seen in the most ridiculous sense now. So to know that it comes back from something in you're telling me a 78? Bro, the 70s were wild. Ah, what a time.
I hype up that decade for a reason.
You're true. It's true. It really is. There's so much creative juices flowing, so many risks being taken, and so much, I don't know, divine inspiration I'm starting to feel like. Because, like, really, any of these ideas, like, no offense to my guy, but someone could have put them in a blending pot earlier. It took that time and the place to make those things happen. So that is awesome for me.
I mean, it did, but by that same token, when the industry became risk-averse in the West in the 1980s, it sort of led to a decline in the genre, at very least in the West, for a long period of time, as slashers and that kind of fare would take center stage in American horror and Western horror. Except for films like Reanimator in 1985, which was a direct adaptation of H.P. Lovecraft's work, they really didn't exist. The most popular zombie films at the time were in Hong Kong cinema, where they would do films about the Jiangshi, which was a monster unique to their culture that bears many similarities to both Haitian folklore about zombies and European folklore about the undead. But the genre was basically dead in the late 80s and early 90s until that influence there in the Far East really coalesced, believe it or not, BK, around video games.
It makes sense. It really does. I feel like video games are just such a great medium to kind of like show the impossible and create the impossible. So to me, it's a no-brainer. I mean, when you think zombies and Walking Dead, you think I want to destroy them. And what better to do that with video games? Destroy the zombies.
You're not wrong about that influence, BK, but really it was kind of a trick of fate, because when Resident Evil comes out in 1996, directed by Shinji Mikami, the game was set to really be a remake of a very novel and beloved survival horror system that basically was invented in the game's precursor, Sweet Home. And that and Resident Evil invented a whole new genre of games, and that was really kind of the linchpin. The zombies were thrown in as a means to an end, but because of the novel gameplay that existed in Resident Evil and the interesting story being set around infected, not dead, but infected zombies, and this whole sort of scientific framework that had never existed before in zombie lore, the game would sell millions of copies in its first year alone and would put zombies back into the collective consciousness.
Let's go. Because I know there's such a big debate on whether there's undead or zombies or infected. I just listen. We can get into it more as we get into understand the zombies that are shown in the film we're showcasing. But to me, a zombie is a zombie, and you wouldn't look at me in the face and tell me Resident Evil doesn't have zombies.
Oh, it has zombies, and so did its counterpart from Sega that year, House of the Dead,
Yes.
which would capitalize off of sort of the tail end of the golden age of in-person arcades to become one of the most successful first-person shooter arcade cabinets of all time. And these two games would inspire several Japanese horror films and would get into the hands of a director we've talked about on this podcast quite recently, one Alex Garland, who had this little idea in his head, BK, about some running zombies, and I think you know where this is going.
Yes, oh my guy, for 28 Days Later. And I think really is like, for me, the start of the idea of the true fear in zombies. I think the idea of zombies being something to be afraid of. 28 Days Later, I think, really started to like set the stage for what a realistic zombie threat would look like.
It's really what made the genre explode in popularity. Like, it had been a regional thing in Japan and in the Far East because of Resident Evil, and it had started to bleed over into the West. But 28 Days Later is where zombies explode into basically their golden age. I mean, between the influential box office smash hits that would come out between 2002 and 2004, like Resident Evil, Shaun of the Dead, Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead remake, the zombie would just not only enter the zeitgeist, but it would experience differentiation, and it would experience subgenres. It would be explored as a movie monster and as a concept, not just as a straight story in the Romero sense. Romero laid the foundations for this, but he was kind of a comet streaking across the sky that preceded this outpouring between basically 2002 and 2015 of just incredible zombie fiction that would be at the forefront of the popular consciousness, kind of culminating with 2010's Walking Dead TV series that would become an international sensation and is probably the most popular piece of zombie fiction in the world.
110% have your qualms, if you will. I know it's not fully based off of the comics that are the source material, but what it does for the TV show, from the acting to the storytelling, the care and the love for the genre is so much felt. And really what they've done to kind of give life to the zombies and making them very individualistic comparative to the predecessors, where it kind of felt like a horde or some sort of hive mind. The Walking Dead, we really get into zombies that have flavor, have sauce, have very similar or weird personalities. And I think kind of leads into a lot of influence that we do see in Train to Busan.
Oh, 100%. Like, basically, in terms of where zombie fiction is today, this is where our long train through history arrives at Busan. Because we now see, and let's get into the zombies in this film a little bit, because if we're talking about a monster movie, we got to focus on the monsters up front. These zombies are of a kind that is now unique within horror culture because it has created what is now known as the K-zombie.
Yeah, the K-zombie is something that has been kind of developing for a while, like in a lot of our history that we've kind of gone through just now. You've seen that it's gone from culture to culture, but mainly predominantly in the West and a little bit in Japan back to the West or Europe. But zombie films in Korea have been around for a long time, and they've been building out what is the modern day K zombie. Of course, it started from films like A Monstrous Corpse in 1981, where Korean zombies were more like the vampiric ones that we talked about earlier, sucking blood and stuff. But zombies kind of evolved from being maybe a demon in presentation, very white faced, very ghost looking. That's kind of all Korean zombies were, from the films Dark Forest to Neighborhood Zombie, Horror Story, Zombie School. It felt like you were watching kind of like The Grudge, if that makes sense, but different. Grudge adjacent, if you will. Train to Busan is really the very first Korean film to come around, put a bow, and define the K zombie into something entirely unique than I think we've seen, period.
You mentioned something interesting by bringing up The Grudge, because something I noticed when we were watching this film is Western zombie films often focus on, the dismemberment, people being pulled apart. Train to Busan, you really didn't have any maiming. You didn't have dismemberment. What you had were zombies that were going all out in pursuing their victims in very contorted, unsettling poses. The actors behind them really seem to know a specialized choreography, ways of twisting and rending their bodies to make you uncomfortable in a visceral way. You don't need to see the kind of graphic gore that you see in Western films, because the nature of the zombie themselves is very unique and very unsettling.
Yes, it's insane. Like the amount of work that is needed between martial artists because of the full movements and the full committalness of the zombies, but on top of like the makeup artists as well as choreographers or dancing, if you will, all work in combination here, specifically in Train to Busan, to really kind of create this unique zombie film. I mean, there's a very big difference between Walking Dead zombies, although they're very stylized and their clothes are fully grunge and they have lots of weird, grotesque looking faces. Train to Busan does something so unique, is that they kind of don't feel just like monsters or living creatures. They feel like they were humans that were only just turned a little while ago. So there's that another level to like the uniqueness and the personality all the zombies have. Them actually looking human and not fully decayed really changes for the emotion and the struggles that the characters can have in there.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a popular trope in zombie fiction to have the recently turned zombie that a member of your surviving party just can't bring themselves to kill because they were special to them in their life, or that, person has some sort of special resonance to them. And Train to Busan does that, but it doesn't throw it in your face. It's something that it lets you ponder as an actualized concept in the film at all times. Like, you can't get away from the fact that these used to be people. Mm-hmm. You can't get away from the fact that they were infected and that this infection is irreversible and turns someone who was seconds ago a normal person into a blood-hungry, mob mentality creature that is coming to get you. And it's that visceral disconnect, I think, where the horror of this film really lies, because it feels like the people in this film, it's not just that they stand to lose more than your average zombie crew, but it's almost different than other films. Like, for instance, when I'm watching like the Zack Snyder remake of Dawn of the Dead, I'm like half rooting for the survivors to get out of there, but I'm also kind of half rooting for some really good action behind that. In Train to Busan, I find myself only invested in the survivors because the way that the virus spreads is so upsetting and so unsettling that you don't want to see your characters inflicted by it.
No, you're 100% correct. And I have to kind of bring it back to the type of zombies. that feeling that you're talking about wouldn't exist if these zombies were any different. And you mentioned a bit earlier the idea of the contortionist body and the full committalness of them. There is so much behind and that process of making the zombies be that way. And there's a lot of intention there. I mean, some of the positions that you've seen and the things they take are inspired by the Brooklyn dance flexing, which is really cool. A lot of your street performers that move the hat tricks around, move their bodies and their arms. They want you to feel like your bones are breaking. You want to feel like there is this rhythm normal humans have, and these zombies are continuously breaking that rhythm. Awkward silences, pauses, and then the speed, Jack. It's the speed. These are zombies that you are gonna die to. And I think like any other zombie, and it's like, okay, it's easy to be like, well, maybe the stupid zombies might win, right? You know what? These humans are dumb for not being smarter than the zombies. Here, it doesn't matter if the zombies are void of any form of intelligence, but their pure crazy zombie instinct and full committal drive to run forward face first towards any sign of sound or blood. That's why I think it's so easy to root for the survivors, is because the zombies are flippin' terrifying, Jack.
Not only that, but I think it's interesting that they use infection as the vector for creating zombies in this film, rather than somebody dying and then turning. Because I think there's a difference in the type of fear that is given between undead zombies versus infected zombies. Now, we've had the, fear culturally around the world of undead rising. Like, it dates all the way back to ancient Mesopotamia and, the descent of Ishtar and Gilgamesh. The idea that the dead shall rise to take the living and the dead shall outnumber the living comes all the way, from thousands of years ago. And so we've had that influence. But the infection idea, at very least when it comes to these being undead or not being yourself, comes up very recently in our culture. It really kind of dates back, as far as I could find it back to, was the 1980s, believe it or not, BK.
That's crazy, because I've heard of some things, nothing specific, but I did hear of, I don't want to say experiments, but tales of trying to use chemicals in order to zombify someone, to put them in a zombie's, state. But does that count as a zombie? Is that what we're talking about here?
That is what we're talking about here. And I think it's honestly important to understand the roots, to understand why it's a different fear than the undead stuff. Because the fear of the undead is this idea of, religious profanity. Because death is sacred in so many cultures. The idea of the undead rising again to take vengeance upon the living implies that the living do not have a respect for the afterlife. It's a very religious kind of fear. But the infection idea comes from a Canadian quote-unquote anthropologist named Wade Davis, who in the 1980s did some extremely dubious research on zombification in Haiti, and basically theorized that people could become zombies via a combination of toxins, drugs, and social conditioning being inflicted upon them. And he even wrote this up in a very specious work called The Serpent and the Rainbow, which popularized a case of zombification and was adapted into a Wes Craven film in 1989. But that's really where infection kind of starts in popular culture, and from there it takes the leap to Resident Evil and the Rage virus that Umbrella is working on, which is kind of the first ever scientific experimentation causing infection that you see in zombie culture. But that also likely dates back to Lovecraft's Reanimator and this concept that was introduced almost 100 years ago of the uncontrollable undead. So really, to me, it's a different fear, because while the undead fear is very religious based, this fear of science turning you into something, turning you against yourself, turning you into something new, this idea that you're being engineered, is, I think, a very different it's a very different aspect of what people fear. And so when it comes to this debate about undead versus infected, I think they're both legitimate zombies because they deliver a different thrill.
I agree with you. I think it's weird, like, why zombs for all, like, they can all be sub-zombie genres. I hate this word. I'm going to hate the word zombie by the end of this podcast. But it is true. All of them have a similar presence of a horde that is going to indiscriminately kill things. You know what I mean? There's a lot of themes that make sense, just their creation or is a little different. And I think infected zombies are my most feared because I know if I was on that train, I could not do half the stuff that our amazing cast of Train to Busan was able to do. Bro, throwing punches. Jack, could you just box a zombie? Could you shove a book in a zombie's mouth to save your life? I don't think so.
Probably not. And just to put a cap on this real quick, if we want to get super pedantic, no zombies that we see in film these days are quote-unquote real zombies, because they're not usually possessed by necromancers, and they're not usually disembodied spirits that are kept in bottles. So unless you're putting that on the screen, you don't have a quote-unquote real zombie.
Yes, go off. I love it. I love it.
But that all aside, and the pedantry aside, the zombies in Train to Busan, I think, are interesting, not just because they have this sort of real life feel about them, this disreality that they're juxtaposed with in the way that they contort themselves and the way they conduct themselves, but because they have this real tinge and this affectation affectation of Korean social commentary that was extremely visceral at the time in the country and came from a director who absolutely pulls zero punches in any of his work when it comes to social commentary.
I love that you said that because we do got to shine a light on the director Young Se-ho on this, because what he is able to do with the tools that he was given is it makes this film even more phenomenal, Jack. Like when I started doing the research, and I know you're doing your research too, and then we're noting back to each other and we're like going off. When I tell you we've had so much to say about uncovering this process between Jack diving through Korean postings and websites and just translating things and getting broken reports here and there. It is such a fascinating story to know that world events and kind of the social commentary of things is very important for our director.
Well, absolutely. I mean, Young Sang-ho was born in 1978 and largely grew up geared towards the world of animation, like a lot of directors in the East. He did not realize for a long time that, you could be an animation director, but he became a huge anime fan and was in particular very inspired by the works of Hayao Miyazaki and last week's director Satoshi Kon. And this influence is what got him into Western painting and got him into doing his own private art lessons that would culminate in him becoming an animator in 1997. But at the time, he's growing up in this environment in South Korea where there's a long tradition of autocracy and rigid social hierarchy being fought against by pro-democracy protesters. In fact, just 2 years, BK, after he was born, this whole modern democracy movement in Korea would be set off by something known as the Gwonju Uprising, where pro-democracy protesters would get involved in armed conflicts over several weeks with South Korean police and government officials.
I've heard of the protests and things like that, but I didn't know we would consider it an uprising, that it sparked so much of a movement. I should have realized.
It's important to know about South Korea because, this was kind of the cool part of this week's history research for me, because you really do, to understand Train to Busan, you have to dig into Korean culture a little bit and understand how social hierarchy works as a sort of rigid keeper of the peace in a very kind of autocratic social organization. You have a business class that for the last, 40, 50 years has largely controlled the capital and the government power. You have a working class that has no hope of upward mobility, to the point where, as it's said in the film, your best chance of getting rich is to be born that way. And it's also a society that is very callous towards both the youth and the elderly. The elderly comprise the largest proportion of the South Korean population, but 25% of them are impoverished and they're largely abandoned. The youth are kind of expected as a necessity to find love and marry, to the point where it is a cottage industry in Korea, where people often pay for engagements.
Wow. It's so crazy to see also moments within the film in my mind when you're saying that and taking note of how the elderly are treated, how the youth are treated in this film, and a lot of scenes that I feel like if you don't have an understanding of South Korean culture, it might not hit as hard. I mean, to be very honest, the entire premise of Train to Busan wouldn't have worked anywhere else. Like we don't have train systems as efficient as they do in South Korea, let alone having such a great like cross section of society being able to be in one place at any given time due to the rigidity of the culture. So it's fascinating that you bring that up, Jack.
Oh, 100%. But it's crucial context for the world that Young Sung-ho is growing up in and building his career as an animator. And his successes from 1997 all the way up through 2010 as a short film animator really set himself up to create his first feature, King of Pigs, in 2011, which is an animated thriller inspired by real-life experience as well as the work of Satoshi Kon. And it really also became a very poignant story about bullying and abuse in Korea's schools. And this is where, despite the fact that his short films had also had social resonance around them, this is where the world takes notice of his social commentary. Because this becomes the first ever Korean animation to be invited to Cannes. So all of a sudden, Young Sang-ho's work is being seen by the eyes of the critical film world in a big way.
I guess I know you're kind of leading up to it because I didn't know this at first, and you're the one who've kind of told me that Young Seo kind of started with animation. There's actually like a previous work to Train to Busan that he kind of gets to. Am I right?
There is, and it's a prequel, basically, a direct prequel. The way he describes it is that his movie in 2015, Seoul Station, which you're referring to, could happen on one day, and Train to Busan could happen on the next day within the same world.
Okay.
But Seoul Station is really where he turned his guns on democratization in Korea and turned his eyes on the social hierarchies in a really biting and brutal way. Because at the time in Korea, pro-democracy protests had reached a fevered pitch because of a counter-reaction to just how bad the corruption had gotten in the country, BK. The year previous, in 2014, saw a true flashpoint in South Korean history with a dramatically horrible ferry disaster in Seoul Harbor.
Oh, I've heard of the ferry disaster. I heard that the government didn't have a good response at all.
That's putting it lightly, BK, is not only did they have a terrible response, but to give you an idea of the way at the time that media in Korea saw its primary duty as covering up for corporate interests and covering up for its politicians, the initial reports on the tragedy were that no one had been killed, and then private investigators would have to be the ones to reveal that the crew of the ferry had abandoned the passengers and that 300 lives had been lost.
What?
That's exactly right. And when this revelation hit Korean society, it was a match that lit a gigantic fire that sparked a new massive wave of protests against the government. And in fact, in Seoul Station, the zombies are depicted fighting alongside pro-democracy protesters for the democratization of Korea. Like, it was the cultural flashpoint of the mid-2010s in the country.
I can't believe it. But I guess to me, then it's a no-brainer that we would go towards leaning to creating media involving, I don't know, an apocalypse, an observation of, that's not how you say that word. I tried to say absolve, but I don't know. The government not existing and not being present in the way it should be in the moment of a natural disaster or crisis, it paves way for a great zombie story.
Not only that, but like the absence of government is notable too, because at the time the country was reeling because of the impeachment proceedings of President Park Geun-hye, because she was being influenced by special interests in the corporate world through a surrogate, and this would eventually lead to her being impeached and being imprisoned. So there is this reaction against the social hierarchy and the rigidity going on in Korea, and you see that reflected in the way that the different people in society are depicted on the train. I mean, think about who the central villain is in this story. It's not really the zombies, it's the successful businessman who sees himself as above everybody else in Korean society.
100%. I think you're right on that. He really is the bad guy, or even more so, humanity and kind of passerbyers, people who let things happen, ended up becoming the villain here, you know, very bystander affectedness. So I love seeing that those stories and these themes are not just simply, touched upon. They're integral to the plot.
It gets into even more complex metaphors the further that you dig into it. Most of the zombies are working class people. The people that have no hope of upward mobility are largely left to become part of this throng. The two elderly sisters on the train, when one of them dies and becomes a zombie, the other commits suicide by letting zombies into the car because she knows there's nobody left in Korean society to take care of her as an elderly, impoverished person. They're relying on each other to survive. When the, young lovers die because the businessman throws the girl essentially to the wolves and gets her infected, and the two lovers die together, it's because the youth in Korea are seen to only have worth if they're put together as a married couple. I mean, the social commentary, when you know a little bit of something about the way that South Korean social hierarchies exist and the way that they work, it's just dripping with that context. It's dripping with things to say about that order.
No, you put it eloquently, because it really is. And I feel like that's genuinely partly why I love Train to Busan, is that it takes such a great look at character studies on people, like bringing up emotional, like isolated stories within the crazy apocalypse setting, within the end of times. As much as there are a lot of films that are out there that talk about great world buildings and things, like, for example, we've championed Resident Evil here, but like the individual stories in Resident Evil, there's a lot to be desired, if I'm being honest. I mean, what we got, Leon? Like, I cared for and hated passionately with a fire every single character that was presented to me in this film, from the first kill attendant to the conductor at the end. You cared for these people. All the characters were believable. They were grounded in the world they were in, and they were competent people. I feel like we've got to get to that, because we talked a lot about the cultural impact that this film has had and the cultural history that has impacted the film. But can we also talk about what I think this film has done to horror film tropes with its subversions to like everything? Because like, this is not your typical zombie flick.
No, I don't think it is. And I think you hit on something just discussing the emotional resonance. And I talked about it a little bit earlier about the way that this personalizes things. I wasn't kidding when I said that I'm not rooting for the zombies at any point in this film. Like, your rooting interests are firmly rooted, as you mentioned, in the characters. You either fall in love with them or hate them. Like, I remember watching the scene where the lovers die, and when the girl gets turned, like, that was upsetting to me. Like, I was viscerally affected by that, not because I thought that they were gonna make it, but just the casual way she was thrown aside by the businessman. The casual way that society disregarded her and decided that she was, not worth escaping this plague. The way that you see the working class couple of the strong man and his pregnant wife have to be the moral barometer for our protagonist's daughter, because no one else will be that in a society that is as broken and as materialistic as this one is. You end up rooting for these people because you see them impacted by the world around them. It's not just about seeing a couple of fish out of water thrown together. How are they going to navigate the zombie apocalypse? It is almost more, as they go on this train, about navigating each other more than the apocalypse. Yes, there are going to be casualties. Yes, people are going to be cast aside, but it's the inhumanity or the humanity with which people are taken out. It's the investment that you have in them because you see their struggles in culture. And I think that's why this is a different kind of zombie film and is something that advances the genre to a place that it's never been before, honestly.
It really has. I mean, like, name a zombie film where there's no guns. I'll wait.
True.
You know what I mean? Things like that, just the typical things that you would expect for zombie films or a horror film. You don't get here. You don't get competent protagonists where they're smart, resourceful, where they use their brains, where they find out, that the zombies are attracted to visual stimuli. Like, learning how to navigate in the world is huge for investment and really helps you buy into the characters more than I think I get with any other zombie film out there.
I think a lot of it comes down to the way it was filmed, because Young Sung-ho understood as a first-time live-action director that he needed to learn a lot of the filmmaking craft while he was on the go. So this film benefited, I think, not only from just an economy of shooting as a director who went from being an animator who would have 10 to 20 takes that he could just dispose of to needing to get things in 3 or 4 takes, but also the fact that he would delegate to his department heads who had just as big of an impact on creating this world. And it is, for a low budget film of only 8.5 million US, it is a visceral experience because of the visual effects and because of the work that was done to create the world.
That's crazy low budget. Like, yeah, you're right though. Like when you find out how long this took, I saw somewhere shooting took like a handful of months. Like insane to me. Like to hear that and see what we see on screen to Train to Busan, because they took so much care, so much detail from the sets. Yes, sets and the use of the CGI with the limited budget. They really had to kind of create techniques that would not only kind of, I think, redefine how zombie films are going forward, but also steps needed to take to genuinely just protect the actors that are giving their full body to these zombie performances.
Oh, 100%. Like, they would even get down to the point where they were individually designing the gravel in the train yards and designing aspects of the trains to be safe equipment so that actors wouldn't get hurt. But they were also working within these confined spaces and coming up with unique ways of shooting that would liberate themselves despite the enclosed space of a train. They came up with and invented a unique camera mount on the ceiling of the train car sets, so that the camera had liberated movement when they were actually doing the scenes. In order to get around, not being able to shoot at certain stations, they would do composites of backgrounds at other stations and of other ones as foregrounds, and then would do reverse projection techniques in order to project that on the side of the train on the sets there. And honestly, they were using novel techniques here, BK.
Yeah, I say that because like novel is right. Like this is stuff that is done at crazy scales in Hollywood with very large production budgets. For a small budget of this film, they were able to utilize these techniques to their most efficiency, like being able to have dummy zombies in order to kind of help for those glass breaking scenes, but also interchangeably with the actors, but then also with CGI to create the overwhelmingness of the zombies, the speed, and again, the haphazardness of them. They had to do what they had to do, because when I tell you it took a lot of hours to dress 100 people in zombie outfit, it's crazy. Like you're gonna need to add other elements like CGI and mocks in order for safety and precautions, and as well as care for all the makeup work that has gone into it. So I give my full standing ovation to the resourcefulness that this team was able to work with.
It's pretty amazing to see how it was all blended together, specifically because you mentioned this, that a lot of this was practical makeup effects on a lot of these zombies. The veins that you're seeing on people's faces, that was airbrushed on there. That wasn't painted and posed. So you have this complex makeup work that then, very much like Ex Machina, was composited onto CGI models and put and interspersed with real actors. But the thing that I thought was really cool about this is that this film actually played a role in creating a massive leap forward for CGI, BK, believe it or not.
Really? It's got to be with the zombies or something, right? I can only assume.
It is. It's with the crowd physics of the zombies, because they did a lot of shooting with live extras and giving the actors that ability to have them to react to. And again, you have to utilize these K-zombie actor performances as much as you can, but also to fill out the zombie horde, to really make it have that kind of World War Z wave style effect to it. You had to create zombie AIs. So what was created for this was not only a zombie AI that could be put into these shots, these AIs could recognize where in the shot they were in relations to actors, and they could react in those frames to bumping those actors. In terms of CGI, in terms of visual techniques, that is an unbelievable, uncanny leap forward in the technology.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I can't wait to see where we can see that more. And speaking of really cool things, I mean, like, and just a testament to how amazing this film is, like, with its, special effects, is a lot of the scenes were filmed all over. Like, different stations were filmed. A lot of the scenes are half and half, or on set. Like, there wasn't just one place they went to film this. Like, no, they didn't just shut down Busan State. No, it didn't work. That first of all, they're going to Busan. All right, get it together, listeners. I knew you were thinking the same thing I was, okay? But they had to kind of combine a lot of different film sets in order to kind of create what I think is a cohesive film. Not for 1 second did I feel detached from the story or the location. I gotta give it to them. Like, sometimes you can really tell, or there's something off, or maybe the actors don't feel right, but everything was so meticulous here from creation to conception.
Because it's such a meticulously constructed film, it lets you focus in on all those great emotions that we've talked about. It lets you focus in on the plight of your protagonists and your antagonists. It lets you get invested in the story of this father who is trying to, through this zombie apocalypse, find a way to be good for his daughter and to be right by his daughter, to fight against the social hierarchies that he's stuck in, to do the right things. And ultimately, BK, I think it's kind of a hopeful film at the end of the day, because despite the fact that our protagonist ultimately dies, his daughter and the pregnant wife of our working class hero, they both make sure that they get to safety, and it is the father's impact on his daughter that enables her to be the savior of them as the two final girls.
It's true. She wouldn't have, our little girl, her daughter, wouldn't have been able to save them. They would have been easily shot if she wasn't able to have the courage to sing and really be an active person in the story there at the end. It's so nice to see a horror film gain a genuine, non-campy resolution. And I say that as a fan of camp, but there's something to be said when a very serious horror film gets a nice resolution that feels gratifying, that keeps you on your toes to the very last second, where you can finally exhale. They give you that release and you can walk away concerned about the world, but knowing that those characters that you stuck with till the end, you can dream for a better future. And I think that is such a nice kind of message there. Like, there is hope, and within life there is hope.
Yeah, I love the message too, but honestly, just thinking about the zombie genre in general, the ending of Train to Busan is kind of bittersweet to me, because it seems to me that we're kind of at an impasse with zombie films, at very least in the West. As a subgenre of horror, it is largely in decline at this point. Like, the horror concepts you see popularized today, it's largely more either high concept stuff or it's franchise stuff. The zombie still has an impact on people, but it's not at the forefront. It's still very popular in Korea, as the sequel to this, Peninsula, would prove in 2020, but I don't know where we are. Are we at the culmination of the genre, or are we just waiting for the next shoe to drop? Are we waiting for the zombie to resurrect itself again?
I think I'd have to say that we are. I think we're in a resurgence, to use some more R words to poly off of your resurrected. It is true. I think we are there. I don't know. Can I say it's a Baroque period? Because I'm tired of saying Renaissance, because that would have been another R. I'm the worst. I don't know if you've seen them. There's tons of, again, specifically the K-zombie out right now. So a lot of the choreographers from Train to Busan who help with the zombie choreography also are leads in the series Kingdom, who help kind of take a different approach. They're more based off of sleepwalking rather than rabies. But then we have, the short movie Alive, #Alive, or They Are All Dead. Great, again, K-zombie films and series that are out there on streaming devices that are phenomenal. I think we are going to start to see bigger pictures coming to the West from K zombies. I think that is the resurgent there. We might not get a West version. I think the West had done their thing and it's dead and gone. Let's lay that to bed, you know. Don't get back up. I'm ready for the year of the K zombie.
Well, it's interesting to see because, well, first off, I also want to give a shout out to 2017's One Cut from the Dead from Japan, which is also considered to be a bit of a modern zombie classic that has gained a little bit more steam in the last couple of years than it had upon its release. But, you know, I just don't know. I would love to see it become something new. You know, see someone take it in a different way. The way that zombies are pitched between East and West is kind of interesting nowadays because it's almost this call and response with this new monster. And maybe the response coming from the West is this Last of Us series that's coming from HBO. You know, who's to say? But it's a movie monster that honestly we talked about in The Mummy, you know, what, you know, our favorite movie monsters were a little bit. And I focused it on the Invisible Man, and I love all the stuff around that, you know, man's inhumanity when they're separated from its own image, and all of that is very interesting to me. But in researching this, I realized that I have a much more kind of personal connection to zombies than I ever thought I did. And I think it's because you and I were lucky enough to really grow up at the time where we saw the revival and we lived in the golden age. I mean, think about, like, at very least my teen years, to age myself, was when stuff like 28 Days Later was coming out, was when Shaun of the Dead came out, like, was when I, you know, really got into the genre because of Zack Snyder's remake of Dawn of the Dead. Like, these films really have a place in my film viewing and in my film history that I hadn't, like, I guess, reckoned with or given enough respect to. And so I want to see the zombie persist over here, and I want to see something new come from it, because at very least in my lifetime, it's led to some of the greatest creative impulses and some of the most interesting films out there.
I have to agree with you. I think zombieism, zombiness, zombification, the zombination of everything.
Get them all out now. Get them all out.
I got it. I'm going. It's the zompocalypse. It is such awesome material to work with, and I think there is a world out there to explore with it. I honestly would be curious to see us go back to the roots. Let's see some more mysticism. Let's see an Eldridge F. Lovecraftian approach. We don't have that right now. We are leaning towards more infected, which again, I am terrified of, but maybe that is what we see. We might get to see some callbacks to some genuine zombies, and that would be exciting for me. One, anything that kind of brings back to their roots and brings back the culture of where something originates from. But two, it could be an interesting approach compared to what we've seen recently, which has gone over the top. I mean, Resident Evil's gone to the point of no return at this point with its zombie/monsters, you know? What if we get something we can understand more? Something that is more closer to home, especially in a post-pandemic world, even though we're still in the pandemic and everyone's in denial. It could be something to see that makes us, you know, really feel that emotional connection from the West, you know, or K zombies can approach it. You know, I'm ready. Shoot, let's see the Chinese do something. Like, open it up. I want to see all the interpretations. Like, this is a subject matter that can be something beautiful in anyone's hands, because there's so much to work with and there's no wrong answer. I mean, we have movies from Warm Bodies to where zombies can become humans again. You know what I mean? Like, there's TV series about that concept. Like, what else is there? I think the door is wide open, and I think Train to Busan is the film that really, I think, started that paveway for our new age of zombies, and I'm really excited to see where it goes.
I am too, and it's interesting to be able to start, you know, because I doubt this is the last zombie film we talk about. Let's be real.
Oh, for sure. We're going to cover zombies again. We'll be there.
But, like, I think it's an interesting one to start with for all zombie films, because right now it's the culmination potentially, but it doesn't have to be. And it's a genre that I am excited to see where it goes. But for right now, we probably got to close the book on zombies for a little bit, because those aren't the only horrors that we are going to be given to you, because we got one more coming this month, BK, and it's all your fault.
Oh, yes. let us explore everyone's worst fears. Perhaps slashers, if you say. Maybe a man called Leatherface and a family that is quite disturbed in the middle of the West as our group of unfortunate teenagers get wrapped into a very frightening night of horrors in the film Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Oh, Jack, are you ready for the original?
No, I am not.
That is right, though. We are going to be exploring the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, one of the OGs from the books. That is the 1974. Am I correct, Jack? Correct me if I'm wrong.
1974 is indeed the year.
Yes. Okay, see? The 70s. That's what I'm telling you. And we're going to see what it's like to get into the idea of the slasher, the chase, the horrifyingness of the Midwest. I'm so sorry to our Midwest listeners, but y'all live in a weird ass realm where anything could happen in the 70s. And Texas Chainsaw Massacre is such an awesome journey to bring you in. A slow burn to an amazing thrill and payoff at the end. And Jack, I can't wait to force you to watch it.
Well, I will say it's interesting that you bring up the 1970s cultural fixation with the macabre, because we're also going to need to do some trace back to a little bit of American folklore, some stuff we might have talked about in Psycho, but really the fascination in America with, as Texas Chainsaw Massacre describes it, the mad and the macabre. So I will get myself psyched for it because of the history that I can bring, but I'm going to be watching this film in between my hands.
Oh, it's gruesome. You got a little bit at the beginning though, so you'll be fine. But I'm also super curious to get into some hitchhiking culture amongst other things. There's so much to dive into about Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but we're gonna be saving that for our next episode. If you want to chat about Train to Busan, zombie vacation, the zombalore of the zombiverse, you can always tweet us at RFN_podcast or hit us up on Instagram at Revenge of the Film Nerds. Please think of more zombie words for me so I can use them in the tweets. Let us know your favorite zombie films or what interesting K-zombie things you're in that might have crossed our radar. I have been in love with the zombie actors and finding out they've been a lot of strong extras in other Korean film work. So please send us your forum film requests and pics and stuff because we love exploring those options.
I have had just the best time getting to talk about this today, BK. This is yet another one of your choices that you just knocked out of the park.
Woo! I'm very happy. I appreciate it because you always have such great, insightful, and like meaty, rich cultural picks, and I'm just like, I like this one. I think we should learn more about it, and I'm excited that Train to Busan was a hit.
Just be glad you're not as pretentious as I am. It's genuinely irritating, even to me.
Hey, listen, we gotta love you. And I think that is it for everybody for today. Thank you so much for sticking around this long. We appreciate you, those who listened all the way to the end of our ramblings and excitement. I believe that is it from us, the Film Nerds. We'll catch you out there in the interwebs.
Take care, everybody. Have a good week.
See ya.